Okay, everybody okay with recording?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, welcome everybody. And this is a talk by Robin on his new book, which I'm sure everybody's got a copy of, which is called Systems Thinking, with the very beautiful strapline, An Organic Language of Harmony for Human Survival, which I think is beautifully put. So without any further ado, Robin, it's all yours.
Okay.
Oh yeah, just one thing. Do you want people to interrupt us as you go along, or would you rather wait till you've done the whole thing and take questions at the end?
It's fine if they interrupt.
Okay, great.
It's going to be quite a lot of ground to cover, but hopefully I've tried to, it's chapters 1 to 7, 2 to 7. In fact, I left out chapter 1. But so yes, and I hope we'll make it. I've tried to just talk. We're trying to talk about just as the salient points, as it were, in the argument. It's not quite the same order as the book, but it hopefully will make sense. The story starts probably in Rochester, New York, in 1969, when I came across Rachel Carson's book. And got interested in ecology and therefore systems. And so I started reading and came across the work of MIT, and it sort of started from there. So next slide, please. Okay. In 1981, I came across, in September of that year, I came across a practical computing magazine, which had a picture of Stafford on the front with his two bare feet on keyboards and his two hands on different keyboards. So he had 4 keyboards. And it was an article about the Cybersyn project in Chile, which I was immediately interested in and bought his 4 books. Well, I mean, the 4 that I knew of then, which were, I think, referred to in that article: Decision and Control, Brain of the Firm, Heart of Enterprise, and Platform for Change, and spent a fairly continuous read, as it were, through those books. And as a result, started looking for him, see if I could find him, because one of the books hints that he gets off at Carmarthen Station, and I lived only 20 miles from Carmarthen, worked in Carmarthen at the time, to try and track him down. Well, it took me a while, but finally, I think it was about April, May 1983, when I did manage to meet him. And we started a conversation, and that conversation went on right through his life until he died in 2002. And the basic thing that he prompted for me was, what is systems thinking? I didn't know much about systems thinking. Still, when I met him, I read the Forrester stuff and other things, and was very interested in it, but and had now read his books, but didn't really know much about it. And he, at that meeting, made the conjecture, which was that quantum mechanics, and I was a physicist, or had been a physicist, was a systems theory. And so that intrigued me. And so that was underneath one of the things I do. I was motivated by. And so I started what turns out to be 40 years of research kind of thing. And what my conclusion to this point is that systems thinking is, in fact, 2 distinct processes of formal modeling of ourselves and our environment. And that within systems thinking, there are 2 strands, and they are distinct. And I will go through and elaborate this. Process 1 is systemic object thinking, because as in the Western world, that's what we normally do. We normally think in terms of objects, chairs, tables, whatever you name, is usually an object and has no reference to its surrounding. And of course, a system is something which needs a reference to its surrounding. And so what I call the second process, if you like, of learning is thinking is systemic process thinking. Okay, John, can you go on to the next slide? And at the base of this is system definitions. How do we define a system? Because that's the thing that we start with when we're trying to build any sort of systems model. And this is a typical systems model, a systems definition. And generally speaking, these sorts of systems definitions don't say much about the dynamics, and they don't say much about the outside interactions from the system you're focusing on. They talk about the internal stuff, but they don't really talk about the outside. They often talk in terms of the attributes of the system, the states of the system, but they don't really talk very much about how that system relates to its external environment. And that seems to me, or seemed to me, to be of major importance. Okay, can you move on? And what I felt was, when I look at the world out there, it's rather like looking at this river, that the world is moving all the time. I'm in a moving situation. So, but there are static patterns within this world. And don't forget, I'm a mathematician. So I've been trained to look for patterns and that sort of thing. So for me, the world was a moving environment with some static patterns. And the system definitions that I saw didn't really convey that sort of feeling, if you like. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I came to make this distinction that there are two worlds, a process world and an object world. If I want to build models which represent processes, which are dynamic, which have relationships to their outside world, then I have to think it in terms of the first of these. A system is an invariant pattern in a background dynamic flow. The flow and the invariant pattern are both essential to understanding. It's this input process output pattern that I discriminate from the background flux by conceptually marking a static boundary, which is defined by purpose that I allocate to it. And this, I feel, is what Beer, Stafford did in 1970. Well, as I think the best example is in the beginning of Heart in 1979, where he specifically says this kind of thing, that it is the observer, the person who's defining the system, who actually makes that definition and allocates purpose to it. Now, I put purpose in quotes specifically because it's not as simple as all that, because purpose really tells you only what the output of the system is. There's also inputs, which are not really defined. So then structural coupling, in a way, says a bit more about that, because it says that it's all those outputs and inputs which couple that system to the environment. But the problem with structural coupling, and I think it probably was designed to be that way, was it doesn't have any teleological part to it. So it doesn't, you don't get the feeling of purpose from it. So I want to redefine purpose, if you like, and say that this is something which includes all outputs and all inputs of this basic pattern, which I'm calling a system. And that system consists of its inputs, the central process, and its outputs. And the central process has a conceptual boundary, which I mark when I'm defining it. And systemic object thinking is based in what is essentially the extant Western view of philosophy, that we follow Descartes and Newton in understanding our world. And that's been called weird thinking by a number of people, because it is different to the majority of the world's thinking and the majority of thinking in history, as it were. Most people don't think this way. They don't define objects in the way that we do, and they don't sort of use that as the basis of the way in which they think, and therefore miss the interactions which are a necessary part of understanding the way in which our environment works. And hence, we're now at a situation where the environment's coming back to get us, as it were. The parts of that system are conceived as objects, described by their attributes and their internal states. So I now see these two things as quite different. And I hope to show as you go on how we can use the first of these to help us understand why they are different and how they're related to each other. Okay, next slide. So when we think about these two, and I've now called them paradigms in the Kuhnian sense, that they are different ways of thinking. The Western way of thinking is based in, basically tends to be talked about as originating from Parmenides in ancient Greece, where we conceive a static world, and that gives us the problem of explaining and modeling dynamics. And it leads to everyone experiencing the same world, and therefore the assumption of realism, which is really, has been anyway, at the heart of Western thinking. Of course, in recent times, that assumption is being gradually eroded. But systemic process thinking, framing modeling in terms of process, then originates, is kind of accepted, although we don't have much of Heraclitus, that essentially there is a dynamic world. But then the question is, how do we explain and model stasis? But from this, if we go this way, what we find is that we end up with the situation, if you like, that we each experience our own unique world, and we need an assumption of constructivism to underpin the way this works. And I'll elaborate that as we go forward. Could I have the next slide? If we're thinking about perceiving and modeling, Kenneth Craik in the 1960s wrote a little book which he proposed a little automaton, which I've elaborated a bit. But the principle is this, that in mode 1, in the upper part of that diagram, if I got this little robot and I want to keep it on the table, in order to do that, all I need to do is to put a little detector on the front, which detects the edge of the table. And as soon as the robot gets to the edge of the table, as it goes along, it turns its front wheel and stays on the table. So that's the normal thing I think we would mostly think about if we wanted to design such a robot. But there is an alternative, and that is in mode 2, in the second part of that diagram, that in the robot, we can have a little model table, and we can put a little model robot on the model table, and we can gear the model robot on the model table so that it goes along proportionate to the way that the robot itself goes along. And when it gets to the edge of the table, it knows, perhaps in inverted commas, but it doesn't matter. It can steer away from the edge of the table in exactly the same way. Now, if you think about it, shut your eyes in a very familiar place in your living room or anything like that, then you can navigate that room in exactly that way. You have in your head a model of that room and that space, and you can pretty well navigate that space. But of course, if you lose your bearings, if we knock the table in this case, and the robot loses its bearings, then of course it'll fall off. So all we need to do then is to combine these two things, and we've got a perfect way of staying on the table. It uses the minimum of checking the outside environment, but builds a fairly sophisticated model on the inside. And so we can use that to navigate the world. And I think this we can propose is the way in which an animal works. So it has a fairly crude detection system. It doesn't need to be that good. But as long as it can build a reasonable model of its environment, it can use that detection system to keep the model aligned with the environment, as it were, and it'll stay on the table. Could I have the next slide? This is the familiar systems model, if you like. What we what we want is that we've got input, we've got processes, we want outputs, and we want that system to have a productive relationship with its environment so that the environment appreciates that relationship as much as the system appreciates that relationship. So if you go to the next slide, please. So if we think about an animal, then we've got this sort of picture, really. An animal in its environment, it's navigating its environment with its internal models and hopefully staying viable. Next slide, please. Now, okay, so we've got to think about how we build a more sophisticated model, and this is where we simply follow Stafford's path, and we can follow the way we set up the model as a fractal structure or recursive structure, as he called it, and that gives us a model which is fractal, exactly as nature is fractal. So the great beauty of process modeling in this way is that it reflects the natural world, which, as far as we can now begin to see, is a fractal world, and fractal models are what we need in order to understand it. Okay, can I have the next slide? This is essentially the same model, but what is important here is that Stafford talks about the systems in focus, and so we can focus at different levels. So when we're dealing with a fractal world, the individual, what you define as an individual, depends on your focus. So we could focus on the restaurant, we could focus on the kitchen, we can focus on some subunit of that. And those are equivalent, those three pictures are all equivalent pictures. So that's one of the things which I think is important and sometimes gets lost in thinking about the viable system model. And secondly, of course, one of the things that also gets lost is these are all dynamic pictures. These are pictures of flows and static boundaries that we've constructed and are conceptual. So they may also vary as time goes on. So it has to be thought of as a dynamic picture, but static diagrams don't really convey that very well. Okay, next slide, please. The first problem then, if we've got a dynamic world, how the heck do we hold steady? And that, of course, comes back to the fundamentals of cybernetics. The fundamental control system, which I've pictured here, is got to be there everywhere in order to hold anything static. I think it was Walter Cannon in the 1930s who asked the question, and I think invented the word homeostasis, asked the question, how do animals stay constant? How do they maintain their bodily functions? How do they keep steady, as it were? And so I think that's a kind of important question which needs to be answered when you think of that you are in a dynamic flowing world. And it's at the heart, it is the cybernetic control model which we need to think about in terms of that. Can I have the next slide? And in the viable system model, we've got the control system, the control system everywhere. At every level of recursion, we've got a management system which is doing the holding steady of the various levels at that level of recursion. So it's there running right through the viable system model. This is the way we can hold steady in a dynamic environment, by having control systems running through the whole system that we're looking at. And the next slide, please. So the animal then at the highest level looks like this. So we've got the parts, the sensor, the comparator, and the actuators are all there. And of course, there's the meta level of the requirement for the extent of the response, e.g. hunger. We go and look for some food, move the legs, If the environment is threatening, we change the environment. So an animal in its environment moves around in order to change its environment, to make that environment more to be one more likely for it to survive in that situation. Okay, next slide. Now, the difference between an animal and a organization is that an animal will have many possible response systems rather than a single response system. So one of the differences between the organization and the animal is is going to be using what we call system 3 to be choosing a possible response system rather than and having others in reserve, as it were, depending on the situation it finds itself in. So the animal has multiple possible processes to construct a required output for survival, given the nature of whatever the environmental input is. So that's the way I think that we need to modify, as it were, what we think of as the normal VSM in terms of dealing with an animal. And there is, of course, necessarily a meta view of the environment there. Okay, next slide. So if we think in those terms, that we can choose different responses from, depending on the signals from the outside, then what I'm thinking here is that we've got an incoming signal, and I'm just using the example of me trying to play the piano. I've been learning for the last 10 years and slowly getting somewhere, but it's taking a long time. But at the highest level, I've got a piece of music to play and I want to hear that piece of music. At the lowest level, then a finger moves and depresses a key on the piano. So the signal, the note in the music, I perceive with my eyes, that signal flows through my nervous system and eventually causes a finger to move. And of course, the next note causes a different finger to move. So this is a dynamic, trying to represent a dynamic flowing picture, which is very difficult to do on something like this. But I'm hoping that you will get the general idea that we've got the switches, the management switches, as it were, choosing the appropriate subsystems at each level in order to produce the desired effect. And as I learn to play the piano, that becomes less and less conscious effort, more and more automatic. So the pathways are there, the pathways are chosen semi-automatically because I've learned how to do that. And that comes from my conscious to my subconscious mind. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I want to talk now really about learning. So we said that animals will have sets of possible subsystems that they could use in particular situations. And when the appropriate situation arises, then that subsystem is chosen. And those subsystems which the animal possesses, of course, have to be generated somehow. Some of them are generated by evolution. So every animal is born with inbuilt systems and will be able to start to function as a small calf born into a herd can be up and running in a few minutes because those systems are already there and learned and pre-programmed, as it were. So evolution provides that. But now I want to think about how does learning happen in order to, over your lifetime, over an animal's lifetime, begin to build on that. So in Ross Ashby's term, how do we enhance the potential variety of command in order to increase our probability of survival? Now, it's struck me that hidden in the idea of metasystem there are actually two ideas. One is the normal idea of a supersystem. Two systems come together to form at a higher level, a metasystem, and illustrated here by the couple formed out of two human beings and operating as a unit, as it were. And so if those two subsystems have the appropriate inputs and outputs, they can couple together in order to form a supersystem. But there's also, in this idea of systems, we've got a different kind of relationship, which can also be there, that we call, say, all tigers a species. And we do that because all tigers have the same sort of input-output structures and react with their environments in the same sort of way. So they have a commonality of the way in which they interact with the environment. They also have a commonality of structure, which is different to, say, a lion, which operates in slightly different patterns. So I think I've identified this and called it a schema system. So within the metasystem, we've got these two different ideas, one of supersystem, one of schema system. And that's necessary. We need that idea. What we are essentially doing is saying, what are the commonalities between these two subsystems in the way in which they interact with the world, and trying to tease out that commonality. And you can see in the writing of even of Plato, Plato does this. He talks about beds and tables, and he talks about beds, there being an ideal bed. We now talk in terms of form, really. So the beds have the same form. So what we're thinking about is the purpose of what's happening here. If I see an appropriate place to lie down and sleep, that appropriate place I can call a bed. Its purpose is to allow me to lie down and sleep. And that could be a pile of straw, or it could be a luxury four-poster bed. They have something in common, which is the systemic schema system, if you like. So now, with that idea, I can now go on and look more closely at learning. So could I have the next slide? So from this perspective, there are just two ways in which we can learn. The first and simplest one is that on the right-hand side of the diagram, the constrained learning. We have a subsystem, and we want to be able to differentiate out two different responses where we only have one response, if you like. So if you like, it would be good if I could differentiate a buzzard from a sparrowhawk, if I'm interested in birds. So what are those characteristics? How can I react differently to the buzzard or to the sparrowhawk, particularly if I'm a rabbit or something like that? And what I'm trying to do then is to enhance my variety of potential command to be able to react in different ways to two different threats in that case. So the learning is constrained then by the subsystem at level 3, and I construct two different responses at level 4 to threats which are similar, but I now want to differentiate. So I want to differentiate between two similar situations, if you like, and thereby enhance my variety of potential command. Now, on the other side, I've got what I've called open learning. I have two situations, situation B and situation A. And I noticed that there are similarities between those two situations in exactly the way I was talking on the previous slide. And I therefore construct a schema system. In other words, I synthesize those two, extract the similarities between those two different situations, and build myself a new meta system, which enables me to deal with other potential situations which maybe I haven't even seen yet. So in order to do that, I've now increased my variety of potential command in a different way and created something new which allows me to look out into the world and deal with situations which I haven't yet met. And this seems to me to be a very powerful thing. It's a very quick explanation, I'm afraid, so that I can only say that I spend much more time in the book talking about this. So we've got two possible learning processes, one of which expands our horizon, if you were, the other of which stays within the horizon that we have at the moment, but does indeed help us to deal further with the world. And of course, by combining these two things, by being able to develop open learning, and then if I meet and start to deal with a potential new situation, I can use constrained learning then to develop that. So I can really open my range of responses very much. Okay, can I have the next slide? Okay, so learning models, of course, have been around for a long time. Systemic learning models have been around for a long time. And the Kolb learning cycle is one such model, and starts with the idea that we experience something, we reflect on that something, and then we try and abstract out of that some learning. We experiment with that learning to see whether it works, and so on, and that's a continual cycle. And that's been elaborated by Peter Checkland to give us a soft systems methodology, which, as I've portrayed here, looks very similar. So stage one of SSM, we gather all the data. Stage two, we try and formalize that a bit, put it on rich pictures and that sort of thing. Stage three, we start to propose and think about what the purpose of what we're trying to do is, what's the purpose of the new model that we're trying to build. Stage four, then we build that model. And stage 5 and 6, we start to experiment with that. Stage 5, comparing it with our original data gathered, and stage 6 to trial it out and see what happens. So I think those two ways of looking at learning seem to fit with the kind of pattern that I've tried to construct. And both the SSM and the viable system model both use the process definition, if you like, the systemic definition that I started with at the beginning. Okay, can I have the next slide? Importantly, William Perry had an experience and wrote a book which was called Forms of Ethical and Intellectual Development in College Years, which seems to flow in exactly this direction. It starts with, if I read your quotation, in the child's first awareness of the world, what are the terms meaningful to him through which he interprets his experience? It seems probable that they are the basic dual terms of his sense of well-being and dis-ease, comfort and irritation, desire and aversion, light and dark, safe and frightening. These are the terms from which he coordinates his first purposeful actions in his own behalf. Physical movement of toward and away, social communication of appeal and rejection, Most importantly, for our concerns, the child will use the simple either-orness of good and bad, permitted and not permitted, as a foundation for his first realization of himself among the people of his moral world. His imperative concern must be to know if he is to be patted or punished, praised or scolded. Is he good or is he bad? So a child starts off in that kind of position. But as a child develops, they go to school and they find that the teacher doesn't have the same views as the parent. And so they've got the trouble then of synthesizing these different views and gradually beginning to realize that there are different views in the world, and there is, a lot of, if you like, relativism, that some views are very different to other views. And as someone grows, then they evolve the commitments to a particular view. Some people don't like that. As Perry writes about the fact that some people retreat because the world becomes, for them, too uncertain. They like the certainty. So they retreat or escape and stop learning, as it were. Now, this seems to me to be reflect exactly this method, this open learning idea, that as somebody goes forward, we gradually can expand our understanding of the world by synthesizing the different experiences that we have, and eventually evolving commitments to particular moral directions, moral standards, if you like, having seen how different ones operate in different ways. So that was an important piece of work for me. Can I have the next slide? Perspective has another effect that what's it called? Shannon-Weaver model. The Shannon-Weaver model is the upper one of those two, that there is a communication source, a transmitter, a channel, a receiver, and a communication destination. And it is assumed in the Shannon-Weaver model that the communication which is received is the communication which is transmitted. But of course, certainly in the human world, that's not the case. In the bottom model, I have elaborated that to take into account the fact that there is an originating mindset which constructs an original message and transmits that original message. That then is received by a receiving mindset, and that received message may very well be different to the original message. So we need to think about communication in terms of the differences of mindset, and that's important when we come to communicate. Can I have the next slide? Perspective for me became very, I don't know, it was kind of St. Paul's revelation. I happened to be walking in Spain, and I'd seen many different Roman milestones, and as you can see on the right hand near the top, there's a Roman milestone in the distance. And it struck me one day when I was walking that what I was seeing was not an object, but was in fact a system, because light was falling on that object, which I was discriminating from the background scene, and that some of that light was falling on my eyes, and I was seeing the pattern which the camera has seen, just as you see it now. So it was sort of the assumption that my Western mind made that I was looking at an object and not looking at a system. If I move, then the pattern changes. And so I then have to, if I had not seen that particular thing before, I would have to try and synthesize those two things. So as I change my perspective, a geographical perspective in this case, then I have to synthesize what I see in order to construct a more complex image. And as I move around, move up to the milestone, touch it, and I synthesize all these experiences, which happen at different times, and I gain, in the end, an object model. And sure enough, when I look for such I find that Jean Piaget, who studied the development of very young children, found exactly that young children don't see an object in the same way that we adults would see an object like that and be able to identify it. He describes it, for example, asking his very young child, where was Papa? Now, the young child was very used to seeing him in the window of his study. So he walked outside to ask the child, where's Papa? And the child immediately looks to the window and says, there's Papa. So the child had not yet, his conclusion was, and I'm really quite describing this very quickly, his conclusion was that the child hadn't yet synthesized the picture that he was seeing before him, with his father standing pretty well next to him, with where he usually saw his father sitting in the window. So that schema system had not yet developed, and their Papa was two different things. And one of them was Papa because that's the one he was used to, and the one standing next to him wasn't the same thing at all. And that was, he explored that and wrote that as part of the child, as the way that children develop their synthesis, their models of the world. So we synthesize our models in that way, be constructing the schema system. Could I have the next slide? So if I describe that process, I discriminate from the background a particular shape, making a boundary judgment on what I'm looking at. I change my position and see that shape has changed. I synthesize these two experiences and construct a schema system of those two experiences. From further experiences, I develop a schema system model, which enables me to recognize that experience from any perspective. And over time, I construct an object model from my systemic experience. And so this open learning mechanism enhances my survival chances. So this seems to me to be fundamental in relating to what I have called the object paradigm and the process paradigm. The process paradigm, where we define things in terms of system, is the fundamental paradigm. And from that paradigm, we construct object models in all brains. Brains do that as a natural way of dealing with the world. And in so doing, they enhance the variety of potential command in order to remain viable in the world. And I think that's the core of what I think, what I've done. And what I've done in the book then is to use these ideas in order to look at two different situations, to look at governance, governing, and to look at quantum mechanics, the two things which got me into systems in the first place. And both investigations do produce results which I think are worth thinking about. So I'll leave that there and answer some questions if you have them.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. Angela, can you come back so we can see everybody?
Yes, I will.
But there was a question from John Waters.
Yes, as Trevor pointed out, Huxley defined, was it? Anyway, the original D in weird was democratic rather than developed.
Okay.
Did you substitute? I was wondering, in your slide, you substituted developed. Was that because of the slippery and easily abused nature of the word democracy?
It wasn't really. I think that probably it was just a slip, but certainly democracy is easily abused. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my chapter 8, which I'm not talking about today, is to look at what we mean by democracy and how we should be thinking about democracy, which, I mean, as a process, should be a process in which we use everybody's expertise, and that's quite a difficult thing to design.
I agree. Can I just throw in a comment on this, because it's been obvious for a long time that we're living in more of a murdocracy than a democracy. It gives some kind of validation to the mass manipulation of a voting system which we inherited, but people don't make informed choices.
No,
I don't believe it's impossible, but I'm glad you're thinking about that. I'll have to read into that, because I have my own thoughts, and I hope they'll have some overlap.
Well, what I've done is to use this theory, and of course the foundation is very much Stafford's approach to the viable system model. And in terms of organization, of course, in when we're thinking about I think about a community, because community at least is a fractal concept, whereas nation is not, as it were. So if you're governing a community, what should that look like? And how could you design a governing system for a community which does use all the expertise of all the people? And I think we can get closer. I mean, it's a very difficult ask, but I think we can get very much closer to than what we are at the moment.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, if not, I have a question.
Yep.
Which is about quantum physics, which you said you're not going to talk about, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Okay.
Because I was, Angela and I were driving somewhere, and we listened to Radio 4, and they had this quantum physicist on, and the guy said, well, how would you sum it up? How would you sum up the really important message of quantum physics? And this woman said, the most important message is you can't understand anything in isolation. It's always the interactions that matter. And I thought, wow, that's pretty much it's a good definition of what systems is all about.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that's the sort of thing you're referring to as you develop the thesis on quantum physics.
Yeah, it is exactly that. That if you like, in quantum physics terms, the observer is paramount, as it were. I mean, I'm just talking about perspective. The observer has a perspective on the situation, and in terms of usually constructing an experiment, that experiment is based on the model that they have of the situation that they are investigating. And that experiment is then carried out, and it either works as they expect it to work, or it doesn't, kind of thing. And that input then builds the picture of how these interactions then occur. I think the problem, the basic problem in quantum mechanics is it started from the realist position, and lots of physicists are realists. So that what they want is that everybody to see the same thing. Hence the Schrodinger cat problem, which you put the cat in the box, and I think it was something like you put a radioactive substance in there, which will, when it decays, which is a perfectly random act, random happening, will trigger the release of cyanide or something like that, and so will kill the cat. So the question then is the cat alive or dead? And of course, you don't, if you're outside the box, you don't know. And lots of effort has been put into trying to make that a realist thing. What happens when you've got somebody inside the box? So how they see something different. Obviously, I mean, it seems a bit silly to me as a systems thinker to worry about that at all. But this is one of the problems which was thought up, and so just to have, they proposed that the cat was both alive and dead. And this has got elaborated to the many worlds hypothesis, which says that in some worlds it'll be alive and some worlds it'll be dead, kind of thing. And these two, this is a separation of worlds, and such elaborate things like that, which seem mad to me. But that's the way it has been, trying to make a realist situation where the world is the world and everybody sees the same thing. But if you allow for perspective and different perspectives, then you get something very different and very much and more easily understandable. There is a branch of quantum mechanics called cubism, quantum Bayesianism, which just proposes that the probabilities of the mathematics of quantum theory are Bayesian probabilities. In other words, they are particular to the observer, to that particular observer. Whereas, of course, the old system was that the probabilities were the same for everybody. And of course, that's much closer to systems thinking because and observer-based, if you like, and taking into account that those perspectives. So much more readily understood. But if you're a constructivist and a systems thinker. And one of the things I was very surprised to see was when I looked at one of the problems of quantum mechanics called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. This was something where you set up an experiment which produced two, usually described as particles, and that I think is a problem in itself. Two particles which fly apart, and you measure one of them at some distance, and you always find that the other one has the opposite state. If you think in terms of perspective and look at this, because you're measuring spins, and if you actually find that looking from the perspective of the person or the experimenter on the right-hand side, they measure the spin and they get it spinning in a particular direction. You measure, you go to the person on the other side, you're standing in the middle, it looks like the opposite spin. But if you change your perspective and go around the other side, it's actually the same spin. So what the realist interpretation, if you like, is very different from a one where you allow observer perspective. And I'm not sure that anybody's ever pointed that out, but it seems for once you think how important perspective is, because we all have different perspectives, we all need to communicate and ensure that what we're talking about is understood by the person we're talking to, so that we got that verification feedback loop kind of thing. So those kinds of things, I found that quite fascinating, but haven't had much time recently to do much about it.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Elena, you have a question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about democracy quite a lot. And it seems to me that democracy requires a certain level of common purpose and understanding, and a certain level of good faith behavior. And I'm struck about how to distinguish between bad faith behavior and sheer ignorance, because it seems both of them are playing a big part, and how that might be corrected. I know that's been a problem in several of the BSM applications that we tried to do, is people with agendas that had absolutely nothing to do with either the organization or its purposes.
What struck me when I was writing this is one thing we don't usually do, although some communities do, is to think about the purpose of that particular community. And I was struck when I started to write that chapter, because I was doing it in France, in a little town in southwestern France, which at some stage had decided it wanted to be a tourist attraction for families, and started a building program from a little village. It now is a town which has a population of something like 25,000 in the summer and 1,700 in the winter. It's converted itself with that particular purpose. And we don't usually do that. And that, of course, does bring people into more alignment than you would normally have. I mean, if you have just random set of people together, then they'd be doing their random set of things and have their random set of purposes. But so we don't do that. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, it's remarkable, I think, when you look at the history of the Second World War, for example, that the country, the UK, which was a country falling apart in 1939 for all sorts of problems, came together because there was this common purpose. And I think that's a very important part of that. How you deal with the renegades, as it were. Obviously, we're now thinking about System 2 and how does System 2 function. I mean, certainly in the UK, it doesn't function very well. I mean, in the formal sense, we're talking about the sort of the courts and the things like that, and how do we bring people into line if they are out of line, kind of thing. And so that's how do you try and design that? Well, I've made an outline attempt in my book, but I don't know that it gets very far. So I mean, I haven't had a lot of time to think about exactly how you would get to the detail of that. I mean, the framework is clear. You start, I mean, it's exactly a System 2. So you're trying to design a System 2 which enables the constraint. I mean, it is a control system to constrain people to that good behavior, if you like. Yeah.
Well, we're having to give one very small example, we're having that problem here in Ontario, where the Premier has a primary purpose of serving large employers, and therefore has been very reluctant to do things like provide paid sick days. In fact, they were there and he canceled them, or even to provide time for employees to go and get their vaccinations, where the public health people have been jumping up and down and saying, hey, we've got to do this and people shouldn't go to work sick.
Yeah, is that hard faith or ignorance?
Well, yes. I mean, so you come precisely up against the Murdoch that John was talking about earlier. That the propaganda, if you like, the propaganda machine is giving people a sort of information and models, which, though in this case, are the models which they build their understanding on, and if they build their understanding on those models and they don't have any others, well, that's the way they will decide, and they will not counter that, if you like. So, I mean, we've got this problem in the UK. Now we've got Boris Johnson still riding high, even though he's completely incompetent, and it's agreed. And it's generally agreed that he's a liar, and appears in the sort of some of the press all of the time, but doesn't seem to make any effect on some people, because the information they're receiving is sort of confirmation that he's doing a good job, kind of thing, and there's no counter information.
Okay, thank you. And another question, is it Lena?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. So the systems thinking and democracy, that's actually my department. And you mentioned Jean Piaget and the psychological development of the child. I mean, part of democracy is that we have adults who can take responsibility, and I'm not going to get into a long explanation here, though I could. But I'm going to go back to Friedrich Schiller, who was talking about three kinds of people. There is the emotional people who cannot handle political freedom and political systems. Then there are the rational people who cannot handle it either, but they're the free people who can think for themselves and who can take responsibility. And the rational people are actually also the team players. So you have to be a team player in order to be in a democracy, but you also have to be able to transcend the team player and the adjusting to the norms of society and for everybody else's expectations and take a personal stand. And so so we really have to look into a much more complex psychology than what you have been talking about right now. And I mean, it was one presentation on one topic, so I won't blame you for not getting deeper into this.
Well, if I go back to William Perry, then that developmental scheme would explain that kind of thing in terms of your first two categories of people being not yet developed as far as the last stages of Perry's developmental scheme. And I think, who is it who writes about that as well? I talk about him in the book, but I can't think of the name now.
The metal band.
No, American.
Keegan.
I'll try and look it up just a second.
Robin, I remember having a discussion with you about Robert Keegan. I think somebody just said Keegan.
Yeah.
Is that who you mean?
Don't think it's Keegan.
Oh, right.
But K seems to ring a bell. Don't think it's Keegan.
I mean, I compared Keegan to Friedrich Schiller. So I mean, he's one of the people who built on Piaget. But really, I had a question that was a different question because you had one slide that compared the object to the system and the process, and you connected the object to the realistic and the systems or the process to the constructivist.
Yeah.
And I wonder what is the thinking behind that? Why would you relate realistic to object rather than to systems and process?
If you one of the things which startled me is that as I was developing was the idea that if you take Stafford's work and look at a VSM, and the foundational idea there was, for, if you like, for every system there is a metasystem, then you can't do that in a realist world, because you end up saying, okay, well, what's the metasystem of God, let's say? and so that I was forced to conclusion that you must be talking about models in a brain when you're talking about these things, as it were. So that so any brain model can have a metasystem, because you can go on building your systemic hierarchy, as it were, in process terms. So you are forced to, if you are in a process situation, you are forced to accept that the world is constructed. The way you interpret the world, you construct your view of the world, if I've got that sort of around the right way. And everybody constructs their own view of the world depending on their own personal experiences. So therefore, we do have to be careful how we communicate, and we don't normally see beyond what I've called the bell jar of our own experience, and we are all limited by that. So that we need to be aware of that all the time. Why? I think that the sort of the Descartes Newtonian perspective, which was kind of adopted by philosophy back at that time in the 17th, 18th century, was because they were looking at very simple things. I mean, if you look at Newtonian physics kind of thing, we're only talking about simple objects and that sort of thing. So we can all agree. So in the end, it comes down to, do we agree on this situation? So it's the context. In this context, do we agree what this situation looks like? SSM deliberately goes about trying to construct that position. So we've got a group of people and we want them to agree on what needs to be done, kind of thing. And so realism is still a relative concept because so my realism might be not be your realism. But if you are talking about simple objects, as Newton was dealing with, as Descartes was thinking about, then it could be that everybody's going to agree on it. And therefore we can say that this law, or whatever it is, this mathematical law, is therefore universal, as they did, and real. And I think this is what a lot of physics has trouble with these days, because the situations we're now investigating is much more complex than that. And so it can't be as simple as that anymore.
Okay, we've got Brian and then Jonathan and then Trevor. You're third in the queue, Trevor.
Thank you.
Robin, can you hear me?
Yes.
My question wants to extend your comparing, or you're talking about Britain coming together at the outbreak of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And I've got Aldous Huxley's Human Situation Lectures in 1961 saying the only way we would get the nations to cooperate is if there was an external invader, like the Martians.
Yes.
And we do have an external invader. Fortunately, it's called the climate.
Yep.
Would you accept that might be an analogy and the nations might come together like Britain came together?
It might. I think one hopes it will. I think, but so far the disasters haven't been great enough, I suspect. But they are getting there.
Yeah.
To disturb the people in those protected positions. I mean, I think this is one of the problems we have now is that there are lots of people who have so much money, as it were, that they can protect themselves, and they don't see what's going on. They don't actually experience or not reading. So their bell jars are, their everyday world, which is perfectly okay.
Yes.
And that's the problem. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are in power.
Okay, Jonathan.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's not really a question, but I just wanted to say how much I liked Robin's book. And there's a couple of things that I think he's mentioned today that I have found really important. So I just wanted to share those. Chapter 6, I think, was quite an eye-opener in many ways, because what it does is give the basis of how new concepts are developed, which I think artificial intelligence is struggling to cope with. But there seems to be a lot of interest in democracy. And again, at the basis of Robin's books, there's some really good ideas in there. One is this distinction of purpose, or the similarity of purpose. And my study of human social groups shows that naturally we don't tend to use voting systems. We do what Robin was talking about when he was talking about Plato and an ideal system. Coming from Wittgenstein via Eleanor Roche, the concept of prototypicality, groups seem to form an ideal member, a concept of an ideal member, and then they don't behave as individuals. When it becomes very salient, they act like that ideal member. So that concept of similarity and differences, we tend to see, because of our Western viewpoint, as everybody as being individuals. But at some point, we actually all start to behave as though we are one person. So that different schema and that sort of thing, I think, is the basis of a lot. And I think we don't realize that nature has found a better way of dealing with things than democracy, because it's proactive, whereas democracy, the only way we can get it to be proactive is to have some sort of executive. But again, some of Robin's points are really quite useful in that if some democracies seem to amplify from their construct partisanship and others don't. And if the whole mechanism of that democracy keeps amplifying partisanship, you just divide that community into two groups. And there's some very useful books that are out recently, I think, that expand on those ideas. One is Jonathan Roach on the Constitution of Knowledge, which shows, examines this question of how do we get to truth. And the other one, which I mentioned last week, Karen Stenner on the authoritative divide, which shows how there are some people, just like Lena was talking about, who cannot cope with large amounts of change or radical ideas. And the trouble is they are there whether you like it or not. So your democracies must be established to take into account those people. So it's just to say that I really appreciate Robin's book, and I thought it was very good. And there's some real good foundational thoughts there that can be taken on.
Thank you, John. That sounds nice.
Did you want to comment, Robin, or should we do Trevor?
Go on to Trevor. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. All yours, Trevor.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. One of the things that doesn't seem to come up, and it may be just because you haven't emphasized it, it might be in your book, is that we do not generally construct our own mental models of things at all. We mostly catch them from our social context.
Yeah.
Because we're tribal.
Yeah.
So most of the things that we really operate by are implicit tribal stuff that we've been trained into without necessarily even having the faintest idea where it comes from.
Yeah.
So we do act as tribes. We don't construct things, or very few of us construct things as individuals at all. And I think that's actually quite important because it explains a lot about the way that people formed. I mean, if you look at political parties, they're basically competing tribes who compete with each other to be allowed to throw their weight around for a few years before everybody throws them back out. But they're operating on almost a tribal basis, and most of what we do is tribal. So most of our constructs are in fact not our own. We've caught them almost like catching a virus. I think that's, I don't know how much you talk about it in the book.
A little, certainly a little. I think what comes to mind is talking about it in terms of scientific method, which in effect is, well, it comes up in two ways, I suppose. In people having to deal with other ideas and trying to synthesize those ideas. So, you might, certainly if you go from one local tribe to another local tribe, then you've got to somehow synthesize the different ways in which you live in those two different places. So that
I mean, well, you might not. You might actually just act in accordance with the one that you're in. When you go back to the other one, you act in accordance with that one. You don't necessarily synthesize them at all, actually.
Well, okay, but I think your brain probably will at least do that for you without necessarily you being conscious of it. But that's one thing, I think. But the other sort of deliberate thing is the way scientific method works, in the sense that I do my experiment and I then have to get other people to try the same experiment in order that they can verify that, and
sure.
And so we develop learning in that way, and that becomes a group thing. I mean, I do quote, I can't remember who it was now, but somebody said science develops funeral by funeral, because the leading.
I think it was Heisenberg. I believe it was Walter Heisenberg.
Yeah. Okay.
It's paradigm shifts, isn't it? Wasn't it, from one paradigm
correct.
to the next? Yeah.
It's all in Thomas Kuhn's book, Structural Scientific Revolution. Yeah. Well, you could say that the scientific method was devised to outwit those tribal tendencies, to establish a governance process for establishing what is an agreed fact.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history of it in the 17th century, that's pretty much what it is. But they also evolved another thing at the same time by an emergence, which was party politics, of replaying the issues of the Civil War between the Tories and the Whigs in a sort of virtual reality safe environment by getting them to jump up and down shouting at each other instead of smashing the place up, which is, of course, a brilliant thing to do.
Yeah.
But they both emerged at the same time, those two They're two
Yeah.
different governance processes that come out at the same time, actually.
But you get the human problem of which we're referring to, about people having to die before the ideas can move on, because you get these hierarchies of
Yeah.
power, as it were, which
Correct.
uh,
Prestige figures that won't be shifted.
Yeah.
You have to wait for them to die, and then you can move on. Yeah.
Yeah.
It happens everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, John, you got a question? Are you muted?
I just want to speak to the synthesis of two tribes. Most of you know Jennifer Wilby. She got her master's at San Jose State. When I visited her in England at the beginning of our conversation, she sounded like a Brit. When we were done talking for an hour, we walked past some British schoolgirls and she sounded like an American compared to the schoolgirls. My best friend's from South Carolina. When he talks to his mother on the phone, he sounds like he's back in South Carolina when he gets off the phone. It's amazing to me how plastic our minds are. When I get a scratch in my lens, my mind immediately works around the scratch and I don't see it anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, Alfredo.
Well, you were talking about democracy and you brought in, Robin, purpose. Well, I think it's much more than purpose, isn't it? Because, I mean, you could take the Nazi party or the Communist party, and they had a very, very common purpose, but you mightn't call them democratic.
No.
I think what the last person, Trevor, was saying, that the big problem with democracy is how do you have a whole, united whole that has autonomous parts? I mean, and how could you have autonomous free beings acting as a whole? I mean, and that is the crucial thing. I mean, you've said your views on Boris Johnson. I completely disagree with you, but we're both democratic, and in any society, we would have to live together. So I mean, and I think the secret is in recursion. I think that that's why Stafford was trying to say that we're our own autonomous systems at one level of recursion, but we need then to unite at a higher level, and that would give us the democratic agreement. So I think the secret is in recursion.
Okay.
And also you were saying about, you were talking about feedback and homostats. I mean, the problem, people say you believe what you see. I mean, I can see you, so I believe you're there. But basically, I've got to believe you're there before I can see you. Maybe it's the other way around. If I was reading the other day, a dog could look at a television screen, and all the dog can see is dots. It can't see because it doesn't know that it's supposed to be seeing things happening. And as Nagel wrote in his famous book, how does a bat see a tree? We have got no idea how a bat sees a tree. So, I mean, it's not just a simple feedback, light coming, bouncing off something into our eyes and we know it's there. We've got to know it's there before we can actually see it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's a really complex feedback loop.
Yeah, that's right. In terms of democracy, I think, yes, it's a common purpose helps to bring people together, as it did in Nazi Germany. But the other part of, I mean, the essential part of democracy really is that it somehow is a system which manages to use all the expertise of all the people, so everybody can contribute. And as you say, you can't do that without recursion, and that's absolutely vital part of that. Alfredo, where are you now? Are you in Cardiff? I see you're.
No,
Are you...
I was a visiting professor in Cardiff, but well, since lockdown, I've not been there for 2 years now, unfortunately. So okay. I'm still there, sitting in my house. And I went out last week for the first time in 2 years. I'm in Newcastle.
Okay.
But nice to see you anyway, Robin.
Yes, nice to see you.
Okay, any more questions? We're coming to, it's about getting on for 6:30. We're nearly closing. Is anything else anybody wants to ask? Any final comments, Robin?
Well, thank you for listening, I think.
Okay.
And I hope you read the
that's
book,
great.
which is a lot more. There's a lot more there than what I've been able to say.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it, Robin. That was great. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. And the next one is Mark Lambert's, which is in. Would you know when the date is, Angela? Muted.
It is in November the 10th, and it is the last one we have planned this year.
Okay, so that's our last one in our pre-Christmas celebrations.
Good.
Good.
Very likely.
Okay, well, thank you all very much, and see you for Mark's in a few weeks.
Angela,
Thank you
did
all.
you say November?
Cheerio.
Yes.
Stay healthy.
Oh, Elena?
I was just, I didn't quite hear. I'm putting it in my calendar for November 10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Rob.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Robin.
Bye for now.
Farewell.
Bye-bye.